we'll have a silent prayer. Amen. Now, I promise I haven't colluded with George with his presentation. Now, because it's going to be, parts of it are going to overlap, which is a good thing. Now, when I started putting this presentation together, I worked out early on that I'm not going to be able to cover everything in one presentation. So we're not going to complete this today, but what we can do just before we finish 10 or 15 minutes early, we'll stop and we'll take stock of what we've gone through, and we'll look at it and apply to what we know now, particularly in the context of the Vespers that we've been watching for the past couple of months. So this is also a review of a series of presentations that Elder Tess did in June 2020. One was called State Nationalism, and the other two presentations were called Do We Have the Freedom? And there was two parts to that. So this is going to be a review, and I want to go through this methodically, and I know we won't get to completion of this. So we'll take our time, and what we'll do, we'll start with Acts 27. What does Acts 27 teach us of? Who does it teach us about? It's two institutions, and it teaches us of, that's right, USA and Seventh-day Adventism, and in two ways. It tells us the negative perspective and the positive perspective. So it tells us of Felix and Festus. And that tells us about the USA, and it tells us about Agrippa. And that tells us about the application being two institutions, being USA and Seventh-day Adventism as institutions. So what this story tells us is it tells us about a journey that these institutions go on between 1989 and the Sunday Law. That being the negative perspective. Or we'll say the bad perspective. That might be not a good way of saying it, but we'll say the negative perspective. And so this first ship is bad because comes from Adramyttium, which is it's dead, and it decides to remain in death. So I shall abide in death. That's what the title of the ship means. Now we've also got the positive perspective, or the good perspective, or the good ship. Remember, it was the wheat ship. It's good, even though it shows us lots of problems it faces. It goes off course, doesn't really follow direction, gets hit by the east wind, gets tossed around by the storm, and finally they're both shipwrecked at the same place. So they both meet at Sunday Law. So this is the good perspective. We'll call it the positive perspective. And this gives us a different perspective, the positive perspective, starting in 1798. And this tells us about the journey through this history. So this is the history through there, through that time period. These are the institutions from a negative and positive perspective. It's good because it takes Paul, despite all the problems, it still takes Paul to where he can get to the island and present the message to the world. Okay. It also gives us quite neatly, this is 2001, the early reign for the 144,000 being here. Okay. So the focus of this presentation, I'm not sure whether there's a title, but my focus will be, well, okay, so at the end of the day, it gets shipwrecked and we want to know why. And it begs the question, well, if they're shipwrecked, they're doing something wrong, these institutions. So we want to know, what is the sin of the United States? What's the sin equal? And also, what is the sin of Seventh-day Adventism? Because there's a reason that this shipwreck happens. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at the history of the USA, and we're going to begin that story at 1619, here, all the way over here. And that was a turning point for the colonies. So 1619 is well before this ship begins its journey. Just keep that in mind. So if I was to look at, say, Revelation 13, we call this a good ship. If I was in Revelation 13, what would I call that? As an example. Something rising up out of the earth. What rises up out of the earth at 1798? Thank you. Yes, it's a lamb-like beast. So we've got all these different parable stories, whether it's Acts 27, Revelation 13, telling us these stories to help us to understand these things. But remember, it's a lamb-like beast here. Is it a lamb-like beast here? That's 1619. Can't be, because it rises out of the earth. It's 1798. This is 170, 180 years before.
Is that when Christopher Columbus?
No, he was before. So this is even before the Mayflower arrived. So this is when they're British colonies. Yeah. All right. So in 1619, they begin the first representative government in the colonies, and at the same time this representative government forms, you have the enaction of a Sunday law and the introduction of slavery within a couple of weeks of each other. Okay, I'll sit down for a minute. So there's no religious liberty or equality or freedom from that perspective. The subjects of 1850 and 1888 are already in existence. So here we see in 1619 the problems of, we're seeing that at the very initial stages when they form this representative government, we see the two problems that they're going to be battling. And it's Sunday law and slavery.
Would they be then governed by what England's belief system was at the time, through the government or through the kingship?
Yes, so the authority still is a big government over them, which is the Great Britain at that stage, because they haven't had to Revolutionary War.
No.
So this is pre that. So this is British colonies still. There's no lamb like beast here yet. So we'll see the subjects of 1850 and 88 already in existence. So it's not really a lamb like beast yet. So what we end up having, which is what we just talked about, we then end up with revolution. Okay. American Revolution for independence from Great Britain. We end up, oh yeah, well, they create the Constitution. Actually, I'll put them below each other so we've got room. Revolution, Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Actually, I'll just keep going for a moment. I'll come back there. So there's two questions. Why does Adventism fail? And why does the USA fail? Why does the United States fail? We don't really want to focus on why does Adventism fail. We'll do a little bit, but I think Molly, over the past 3 or 4 weeks in prayer meeting, has done a really good job explaining that, and George has just been going through why that is, and we know why Adventism fails, which is what George was explaining. We've got the Apis bull, we've got this mindset that is like a compare and contrast. We've got modern Israel and compare and contrast ancient Israel. So we've got apostate Protestantism and the way they think. We've adopted that mindset, which is what George has been explaining to us really well just before. So another way of, so it's a form of idolatry, conspiracy theories, Walter Wyeth, which is what George was saying. In saying that, we've got the way, I want to put this on the board still. So we've got a one world government. Now, we all believe that still, but the problem is, what does that look like? What does that actually mean? Now, George, in his presentation, called it a 10-nation confederacy. And we've seen this diagram before. And we've got the right wing, and we've got the left, and we've got Fox on this side, as an example, and CNN on this side. And when they communicate, they look at a threat, and this side would, CNN or Fox would say the threat equals globalism, as an example. And CNN would say, no, that's not the threat. The threat, Fox says, CNN says, the threat equals unilateralism. Or American imperialism. And so if you came from that perspective, if we use Trump as an example, Trump would look like a hero. On this side, Trump would look like the dictator. And this is why it's so important. Everything that George was saying is right. We think the same as we used to, conservative evangelical Protestantism. And that was why it was so important that we made this jump from right wing to left wing. And it depends on how you view the world and what your political perspective is, depending on which side you find yourself. It will mean something totally actually opposing sides. And so the methodology here would be conspiracy theories, which we're not going to go into. George can do that. And this side would be parable methodology. And people go, oh, what do you mean by that? Well, if I was a CNN historian, I would understand my history, and I would say, as an example, I would look at the dictators of the past because I'm a historian. I would understand this, and all of a sudden you'd start seeing red flags pop up here and there. And so what they would see in the Republican Party or Trump as a person, they would start seeing things that they recognise, and they would go back to dictators of the past and see repeating patterns, and they would see red flags, and they would be sick to their stomach. And what would they then do? They would then come on a show or write an article and give a warning message based on, this is what happened in the past. In World War I, this is what it looked like, and then in World War II, this is what Hitler did, and this is it. And then they would say, see what's happening now in the modern version. And what's that? That's a triple application of prophecy. So they're using parable methodology externally, outside the movement. But our focus today is not on why Adventism falls. We want to focus on what's the sin of the USA. So another way of looking at that is, we could say, how do we understand what the sin of the USA is? We've already got what happened at the start. We would say 1850 plus 1888 equals, or the sin. I'll say the sin. What's another way of saying that? We could say it's early writings plus the great controversy equals the sin. Who remembers what these chapters are? So we've got the sins of Babylon chapter plus scriptures the safeguard equals the sin. Another way of saying that is, we could say, well, this is where they break the 6 commandments against human beings, their fellow human beings. This is breaking the 4 commandments against God. Crime against humanity, crime against God. In our history, we'll break the 10. Well, that's whoever, they will break the 10. So the purpose of this, we want to look at this literal history plus this literal history equals, who can tell me what I should be writing there? Spiritual. Or the symbolic. So I guess there's 2 ways we can do this. We could cut the line and say 1850 plus 1888 equals this history here. I don't want to do that or now. I don't want to do that. I want to show it as one big consistent story of progression, so we can see the issues built, so we can see the problems right through. And I don't want to cut the lines at this stage, so we won't be doing that. So that's why I've done this line here. That's basically going to represent these histories and more. Okay. So People don't recognise that America is dealing with the same issues today that has plagued it for 400 years. The issues being faced today are connected to the issues that were in existence at the beginning when America began as colonies. So that's why we're going to look at it as a progression. So if the Sunday law is the storm or the shipwreck, say that's the storm, does a storm hit you unexpectedly? Just all of a sudden it's over you and it's flashing and bearing down on you. What happens? So what you see, here's the horizon. All right. What do you see in the distance?
Landscape.
Yeah.
Clouds.
It starts building, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously a cloud. And what ends up happening, that storm builds, the clouds build, it gets bigger and bigger, you start hearing it, you can see it, but it's far off, like it doesn't spring upon you. It doesn't come you unaware. So what we're doing now, we're looking back at the horizon, and the horizon is 1619. Now, can this storm, I'll ask a question in a similar way, can a storm come to people as a surprise?
Yes, they can.
What if you're not even looking?
You're asleep.
You're asleep. If you got your fingers in your ears, if you're not listening and you're not looking, the storm can still come upon you, and before you know it, it's bearing down on you. So what we're wanting to do, we're wanting to be prepared. We're wanting to look at the storm coming from afar off, and that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at 1619. We want to see this storm build and see what are the principles of it and why is it a problem, because we want to understand what the Sunday law is going to look like. I mean, obviously we want to understand it so we're prepared, so we can help our families and help people we come in contact with. So let's start. So back here, I'll rub this out. Representative government back in 1619. I also introduced Sunday laws and slavery within 2 weeks. Okay, representative government, Sunday law, and slavery. Move forward, we end up into the American Revolution. They gain their independence from Great Britain. They create the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and also, what do? They form a republican government. I might just put revolution just there. So, republican government. And what set of ideals did they put in place when they formed this representative government? What did they do? What they did, they separated church, put a wall, and state. They put a wall there. And then what else did they say? All men are equal. Can you see that 1619, they started a representative government, they introduced the Sunday law, and slavery came on the books within 2 weeks. When they gained their independence, leading up to 1798, they formed a representative government. They put a wall of separation between church and state, and they said men are equal. So what are they directly challenging?
Worship and gender.
They're challenging Sunday law and slavery. So at the beginning, they have an issue with government-enforced morality in the form of a Sunday law. So as they form a new nation, they separate church and state and put a wall up. The second issue of slavery, they say all men are created equal. So at 1798, what happens? So this is where the good ship begins. So they've got a foundation of being positive. So are we seeing a lamb-like beast form and rising up out of the, okay. So we're starting to see principles of freedom of religion and equality, or we'll say equality. And we're going to go into this very briefly because George touched this as well. And he went into more detail. I'll just mention it. What else happened in 1798? We had an election, and the election was between, we know it was Adams and Jefferson. I'm running out of room here. I might put them up here. Adams, Jefferson. Molly also took us through this a couple of weeks ago. You did a good job. So what I really liked about what George said in his presentation was this was just more than an election. This represented a split in Protestantism. Why did this represent a split in Protestantism? Why? It's because the whole population were Protestants. There's a few Catholics here and there. So when you think about it, if there was an argument in the country between all the people, the argument between the people that splits the people is going to split Protestantism because they're all Protestants. An argument within Protestantism is then going to split the people because they're one and the same. So what are we learning in Vespers now? That we're in a post-Christian world now, but back then, if I could be general, everyone were Protestants. And that's why it was a split. It was a split in the country, but it was a split in Protestantism because everyone was a Protestant. And so what this represents here, and I'm duplicating what Elder Tess did in her presentation because I want to make some points later on. This represents the split that occurred in 1798. So George also mentioned this was at the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening happened during this history, on and through the Revolution, and the Second Great Awakening happened in early 1790 right through to 1830s, 1840s. So right at the beginning of the Second Great Awakening, we've seen this split in Protestantism because Protestantism is the entire population, pretty much, if I could be general. Now, what did they split into? They split
North
into...
and South.
Sorry?
North and South?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
North and South.
North and South. Yeah, sort of. We'll go into... It ended up that way, and what we'll do, we'll trace that history and see how that grows. But yes, you're right. And in particular, it split into two different ways of thinking, two ideologies. One was the socially conservative. And who did they follow? Which candidate did the socially conservatives follow? And we'll trace them on that line there. Adams. So the socially conservatives, the conservative faction of Protestantism, lean towards Adams. Now, obviously, then we've got socially liberal, buoyed up and energized by the revolution that they just have. Socially liberal will follow Jefferson. So the conservative branch, which George went into in more detail, they used the Illuminati conspiracy theory threat to take down the enemies of Adams on both sides, which we know were Hamilton and Jefferson. So the beginning of the lamb-like beast, you see two sides form at the beginning of the ship, which I've rubbed out. At the beginning of the lamb-like beast, we see the country split in two. Almost reminds me of what the everlasting gospel does. One uses conspiracy theories. The socially conservative side uses conspiracy theories. So now we want to look at the issue of slavery and how the subject progresses through the history past 1798. Because both of the arguments of abolition and forced slavery are made by Protestants, because everyone's a Protestant. So, like I said before, a split in the country equals a split in Protestantism and vice versa. A split in Protestants equals a split in the country. So when a fight over slavery occurs in the North and the South, which is what the comment was just made, it's a fight over different factions of Protestantism. So now I'm going to read some quotes, and this is from a book, America 1844, Religious Fervor, Westward Expansion, and the Presidential Election that Transformed the Nation. And this is the quote. So now we're going to look at the different perspectives of Protestantism and how they're going to address the subject of slavery and how that split developed and got more polarized. 41. The year 1831 had been a propitious one for the embryonic abolitionist movement. William Lloyd Garrison founded a newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. Abolitionists in Boston founded a New England Slavery Society, and slaves led by Matt Turner rose up against their masters in Virginia. Southerners were annoyed by Garrison and the fledgling society, and they were scared to death by Matt Turner, and that was a slave rebellion. That's why they were scared of that. So this is the good side, or the abolitionist side. So you're starting to see the socially liberal forming communities and rising up against slavery. 2 years later, in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded. Its leaders soon launched a campaign to petition Congress to end slavery. So what's important about 1831 and 1833 from our perspective? And that's the formalization of the message, isn't it? So these, see, you can see what's happening externally, all these historical events, which is these are all events tying into the eventual Fugitive Slave Act, or the Sunday Law of that history. So you can see this building, these. In 1824, an English Quaker, Elizabeth Coltman Hayrick, published a bold tract entitled Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition. She was the first of many devout women to defy the more conservative male leadership in the anti-slavery cause in both countries. So, and this is the anti-slavery side. Her influence was instrumental in the eventual passage of the Emancipation Act of 1833, which began the liberation of West Indian slaves, although she died 2 years earlier. So this is influence on both sides of, I guess we could say, old world and new world. So this is a dynamic that's being affected on both sides of the Atlantic. No less important were the female anti-slavery societies, where such noted speakers as the Quaker Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cody Stanton, the eloquent black sojourner Truth, and others began their speaking careers. Most famous of all were Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Quaker converts from South Carolina who spoke to the horror of the conservative clergy at promiscuous mixed male and female audiences. Women were only supposed to speak and teach other women, but these, to the horror of the conservatives, these women would address mixed audiences. So it's quite ugly, but normal back then, I would suggest. So we've got quite strong individuals here that are on the right side of the issue. All of this, and by the efforts of other individuals, led to the American Anti-Slavery Society of 1833, an abolitionist society formed by William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Taffin. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, was a key leader of this society who often spoke at its meetings. By 1838, the society had 1,350 local chapters with around 250,000 members. And that you got to think about the population back then was about 12, 13 million. So this is a significant group of people who are now rising up. You can see the development of abolition as a group of people. So we're going to put that down, 1833. Anti-Slavery Society. It's really bad writing. Okay. Okay. So this is, remember, this is two sides of Protestantism forming. Charles Finney was a leading Protestant preacher. He was an abolitionist. He was a speaker and led Oberlin College. This was the first American college to accept women and black people as students in addition to white men. This is a quote. From its early years, its faculty and students were active in the abolitionist movement. They participated together with people of the town in biracial efforts to help fugitive slaves in the Underground Railroad, as well as to resist the Fugitive Slave Act. These people were on the right side of the issue. These people were helping fugitive slaves in the Underground Railroad. And did you hear what they were saying? They were all both biracial efforts. They would come together as a group biracially and fight against the Sunday law of that history, the Fugitive Slave Act, and help the efforts to help escape slaves. Now, this is a Protestant minister. So we're seeing, I hope we're seeing this side build. It's growing, it's expanding, this split. Okay, so what we're seeing is the socially conservatives are for slavery, obviously. But now we're reading quotes that are talking about the socially liberal group, and they're actually abolitionists or against slavery. They hate slavery, they don't want slavery. Okay, and I just want to make a point here. Remember, the original concept was all men are created equal, all men are equal. And so you're starting to see them live that when they're coming together as a biracial community, even back in the early 1800s. Okay, so what we're seeing, this group is fighting for equality. Okay, and they don't necessarily use those words, but if you look at what they're doing and look at how they're behaving and how they're acting, obviously to allow people of colour into their universities and women, they've got an underlying view that, because they're Protestant, remember, God has created human beings and we're all, yeah, even though it's 1830 and women can't vote yet. Okay, so I understand all that, but if you look at it from the time and their perspective, compared to this perspective, we're seeing a drive for equality, and this is a drive for something else. So now let's move forward. This is not a reform line. I'm not trying to make a reform line here either. So these events lead up to 1844. What happens in 1844? Yeah, maybe we'll get to that. But what we're seeing, we're decades down the track. So we're seeing decades of tension build between these two factions. So okay. And it blew up into a schism in the three main Protestant denominations. It split. So in 1844, there was a split. All right. And it was between the Methodists. So in the Methodist church, there was a split. In the Baptist church and the Presbyterian churches, there was a split. And particularly along the lines of the North and the South. This is the split that couldn't be reconciled. And this is what led directly to the Civil War. So in the 19th century, slavery became, this is a quote, became the most critical moral issue dividing the Baptists in the United States. So what ended up happening here, the division happened through decades of compromise. So before 1798 and leading into the Second Great Awakening, Baptists actually opposed slavery. They never taught slavery was biblical or not a sin. But as the Baptist missionaries went into the South, they struggled to get a foothold. So they began with small steps to compromise their message. So the next generation of Baptist preachers began to assimilate into society in the South. Rather than challenge slavery like they did in the beginning, they began to interpret Bible passages as though they supported slavery. They started to defend slavery against the North in a type of nationalistic way. So what ended up happening, the North still, they didn't compromise at this point. They were still, the Baptists in the North were saying, what are you doing down there? You've got, you got to tell all those people down there, stop owning slaves, it's wrong. And the South, over the course of decades, they slowly assimilated and started saying, well, stop interfering and, sort your own problems out. And it became, the South felt victimized. And why are you interfering in our lives or our states? Sort your own problems out, stay away. So you can start seeing sort of a nationalistic undertone start developing. And the South started resenting like this intrusion by the North into their territory. And so they started pushing back. And then they'd start, using their Bible verses as well. Well, what about, and then they'd start using the Bible verses to justify their positions. Why maybe God is okay with slavery because look at this verse, and this verse. But they originally didn't think that way, which is interesting. Stop criticizing us. So they felt like the victims. The South were the victims. So they became nationalistic in their behaviour towards the North. And eventually they then started to preach to the slaves to accept their place and obey their masters. I guess just like Paul did. In the second decades after the revolution into the Second Great Awakening, the Southern Baptist preachers abandoned their pleas that the slaves be freed. And that was a quote. So that tells you that right at this history at the beginning, leading into the Second Great Awakening, they stopped preaching that you need to free the slaves. So they almost compromised and adopted slavery. And then they started using eventually God and the Bible to justify that position. And in the end, they said God mandated it. So that's how far you can go. In 1844, Basil Manley Sr., president of the University of Alabama. So we're talking about this. Now we just talked about the abolitionists. Now we're going to look at the Protestant conservatives. And so here we're talking about president of the University of Alabama, a prominent preacher and a major planter who owned 40 slaves, drafted the Alabama resolutions and presented them to the Triennial Convention. These included the demand that slaveholders be eligible for offices to which the Southern associations contributed financially. So in other words, the South saying, we're giving you money, we support you, and we therefore have a right to be on these, we have positions of responsibility we can admit slave owners to denominational offices in the Baptist Church. And those resolutions failed to be adopted. So the northern churches said, no, you can't do that. So you can start seeing the divide and the tension happening. We're giving you money, we're supporting you, and we're not allowed to even have a position on the board, as an example, or a position of responsibility or authority. They wanted positions of authority. Eventually in Georgia, they decided to put the North to a test because the North still claimed to be neutral. So at this stage, the northern churches weren't pushing it so hard yet. And when a position opens up in a home missionary society, Georgia recommends a slaveholder. The home missionary board refuses to appoint him, noting that missionaries were not allowed to take servants with them. So if you can't take a servant with you, are you allowed to have a slave? So you see what they were doing? They were sort of rejecting slavery in a roundabout way. So they didn't want to make a decision that appeared to endorse slavery. So they couldn't accept that person, that slaveholder, in a position, because that would appear that they're endorsing slavery. So it's a little bit round way of saying no. So what's the Southern Baptist response? The Southern Baptists considered this an infringement on their rights to determine their own candidates. So this is a fight between the North and the South in the Baptist churches. The South is saying, we give you money, we give you support, and over the decades, they begin to see more and more that slavery is mandated by God because of the literal interpretation, which is what George was going through. Ancient Israel had slaves, so therefore modern Israel must have slaves. And so they have two arguments to defend slavery. So they're saying to not support slavery or not let us Southern ministers support slavery in our own states, in our own home, is a violation of our freedom. So what's their argument? And it's a violation of our religious liberty. Freedom and religious liberty. So the South's argument to the North is you're violating our freedoms and you're violating our religious liberty to practice our understanding of the Bible and Bible history and what God requires us as human beings and as a nation. So you're taking our religious freedom. You're not even letting us interpret the Bible the way we understand it. Just see the argument. So this causes the split in the Baptist churches. And a similar thing happens in the other two Methodist and Presbyterian churches. There's other dynamics going on, but that's the underlying issue, and the causes of split is the subject of slavery. So now we'll go into what John said. What else happened in 1844? So remember, the churches are Protestant. So what's the government full of? Protestant men. They're full of Protestant men. And so there was an election in 1844. And what was the hot topic? You might remember this from Elder Tess's presentations a while ago. There was an annexation of Texas from Mexico. So here we've got a divide. So here we've got a divide here, but we've got an election as well. And so they wanted to annex Mexico and admit it to the Union as a state. The election went on the wrong side of history and they annexed Texas, which led to the Mexican War a couple of years later. So this is part of what they call the Western expansion. So they're on this side, the states. I'll bring up a screen share. Okay, so you can see, can everyone see that? Okay. Everyone see that as a screen share? I'll just keep going as though you can. So if you can have a look at this map, I don't fully understand all the details surrounding that history, but you can see all the states over on this side. So, and what they're wanting to do, they're wanting to expand west into the Northern Territories, and they want to go from ocean to ocean. So they're expanding, and during this expansion, they annex Texas here. And there's an argument over this here, where to put the boundary. That's my understanding anyway. I'm still a bit sketchy on the details, but my understanding is that the argument is how far, where's this border going? And that developed into a war between Mexico and these states over here. So they annexed Texas here. So as you can see, the subject is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48. That tells you when the war was. And this was the dispute. So I'll stop share. So the election was about, do we do this or do we not do this? And the election was won by the Conservatives, and they decided to expand and annex Texas. So when we're talking about this expansion, remember, this is what the Conservatives are wanting, okay? So the Conservative branch supports slavery, and they want to expand west. And now we're going to read some quotes about why. So another character we want to talk about is John C. Calhoun as well. So he spoke, he's a senator from South Carolina, I think. I'll get that. It'll come up in a second. At the time, US and Mexican diplomats were in the midst of the peace treaty. So now we're in January 4, 1848. So what's happened? They annexed Texas. They go to war from 1846 to 48. And in 48, the parties come together and negotiate a peace treaty. And they basically arguing or deciding how much of Mexico to admit to the Union. And the question is, how much of Mexico did Calhoun say the Union wants? So that's our question. And this is his speech. We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the type of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half of the Mexicans are Indians, and the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribes. I protest such a union as that. He doesn't want a union as that, okay? The great misfortune, oh, hang on. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America is to be traced to the fatal error of placing these black races with equality with the white race. Are we to associate ourselves as equals, companions, and fellow citizens, the Indians and mixed races of Mexico? Mr. President, I would consider such a thing as fatal to our institutions. We make a great mistake, sir, when we suppose that all people are capable of self-government. We are anxious to force free government on all, and I see that it has been urged on a respectable quarter that it is the mission of this country to spread civil and religious liberty over all the world, and especially over this continent. It is a great mistake. None but people advanced to a very high state of moral and intellectual improvement are capable in a civilized state of maintaining free government. All right, ugly words, but what's his argument? What's he saying? The United States decide to take some of Mexico, but not all of it. Why? They aren't white enough. They're mixed. It's not just Indians, they're mixed. So there's a combination. They're not quite white enough. It's the original border wall.
So what makes Mexicans in Texas?
Sorry, say that again.
There weren't Mexicans in Texas annexed to?
I think there was all through that history, but they're trying to expand west, but there comes a point where they don't want to dilute their white race. So remember, they've got African Americans in their country already. And now they're looking, going, well, we'll take, how much of this country do we take? If we take too much, we're going to be equal with these people. We can't have that. It's really ugly. And what's the justification he just used?
That they can't govern themselves.
What's his argument to defend slavery, or to defend racism in this case? We are anxious to force free government on all. It is a role of this country to spread civil and religious liberty. So the argument used on behalf of this belief is freedom. So now we're in 1848. Right? I'll put 1848, but it's through this history. This is a sort of a progressive story, because remember, in 1844 was the election, and all the annexation of Texas happened, the war happened. So I'll just put it here, and we'll just put Texas annexation, even though it happened back here. And the consequences were the war, and then they got the territory and kept expanding. They then got the Oregon territory of Great Britain, and that took them all the way to the ocean on the left side of the country. So what's the argument? Freedom, religious liberty. So this is in the context of the role of the United States, and they were to protect that role. Okay, so this is, now we're heading into what area now? We're at 1848. How close are we to what? Well, 1850, which is the Sunday law of that history. We're not going to go into detail here. We could. So we're 2 years here. We're 2 years out to 1850, and this is where they came to their disagreement between the North and the South. And how did they resolve it? By introducing or reintroducing Fugitive Slave Act. Remember, the Fugitive Slave Act was on the books all the way back here. So who wrote, Catherine and Elder Tess has taught us this, but Catherine taught us this a little while ago and it's caught some of us by surprise because we'd forgotten. Who wrote and enacted the Fugitive Slave Act in this history? It was, who wrote it? This side or this side?
Colvin did.
It was actually this side. You can see the compromise occur. It was written by Virginian Senator James N. Mason, and the original act was 1793. So he wrote that, and he was on the good side, if you want to call it, to try and keep the union intact and to address the grievances, and we'll go into that shortly, what those grievances are. So we'll just skip over 1850. And why did Alan White say the judgment is on the North at this stage, you know, in the Civil War history? Because the South is already gone. They're already in a mess. It's because they compromised. They compromised this way. And they were not allowed to, and they did. So now we'll head into the Civil War. So we've had a split back here in the churches. Now we're going to see the states divide.
Is that the entire Civil War, or are you going to the mid?
Sorry.
Page 65.
It'd be 5 if you're doing that.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, my mistake. Okay, so it's 12:14. So right now we're about to get into what divided the states and what grievances they had and how did they look, how was their mindset, what did they see was the problem. So, and this is where the topic of states' rights come in. So it's not a simple issue. And why is it not a simple issue? State rights are not a simple issue because the North used the argument of states' rights to bypass the Fugitive Slave Act. So back here, the North, some of the states didn't enact it properly. They bypassed it. So they said, well, we're a state and we have the right to do what we want to do. Stay out of it. So they said, we're not going to enforce this Fugitive Slave Act. So there was, and that became one of the main grievances of the South, because then they're saying, well, you're saying the federal government is coming in saying, oh, you want to, free these slaves. Well, we're states, we can do what we want to do. We have the state rights to not have this overbearing government come in and tell us what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we should and shouldn't be living. And so state rights is actually it's not a simple topic, because it was used as an argument here to not enter into, and so some states were actually using that argument. And that was one of the big grievances heading into into this history here, because they could see what's happening. Lincoln just got elected, and the South saw that as a huge threat, because they saw him as an abolitionist-backed movement that was going to strip them of their freedoms, of their states' rights. Okay, and we're not going to be able to go into that because we're running out of time. So what we'll do now, as we've looked at the two perspectives of Lincoln, we've seen that there's a positive perspective and there's a negative perspective. So from our perspective, we're going to look at him as positive. He was a good choice, even though God had to twist his arm behind his back to actually abolish slavery, because even his own words said that if I could keep the Union intact and not free one slave, I would do it. So his priority was to keep the Union, but the South didn't see him that way. They saw Lincoln was an existential threat, that he was going to interfere, basically come in as a dictator and intervene and take away their rights to live and believe how they wanted to believe. And how did they want to live? They wanted to have slaves. So it was an existential threat to their society, their way of life. And we're going to go into that next time. We've got lots of reading for next time to go into the arguments of the different states. So I guess what the argument, before I even get into it, I'll just briefly say the argument, I'm hoping you can start seeing a pattern emerge. So as I keep going through this history, and I'm going to rub that out because that history will keep going right up to now, what argument are you going to consistently see on the conservative side? And what are you going to see pop up through here?
Equality.
So we've been looking at the Vespers we've been involved for a couple of months now, or 6-8 weeks. And we've all gone, oh, wow, this is amazing, and it is. But Elder Tess has been saying this 2 years ago. She's been saying this conflict. So every time there's a topic arises where these mindsets collide, which side is picking what?
Conservative picks freedom.
So you can start seeing the clash of mindsets and the clash of ideas every time. Even the annexation of Texas, like there's so many topics through these histories where these come in contact: equality versus freedom. And what we want to do next time is keep tracing that. We can go all the way to the civil rights movement. What do you think we're going to see there? We're going to see one side fight for freedom and religious liberty to practice their version of religion how they want. And we're going to see the other side fight for equality for all. And after this, what's the history after 1863, 1865?
1888.
This. So we're going to spend a bit of time on that. What do you think we're going to see there? So the question is, what is the sin of the USA? The topics keep changing. Yes, it's the sin of slavery and abolition. Sin of slavery. And then it's Sunday law in 1888 and that history, either side. Lots of things going on there. We'll go through some quotes with that. But what's the I guess what I want to show is Elder Tess has been saying these things for quite some time, and she's just giving it renewed light in a new perspective, and it helps us to go back and this is, I wanted to put on the board exactly what she put on there, because she's basically seeing the clash between conservatives, socially liberals, and the fight for freedom and religious liberty is the argument to justify this position. And the argument to justify this position is to try and fight for equality for people. And we're just going to keep tracing that. Yes.
Sorry. So are you saying the sin of the USA is that they consistently kept prioritizing freedom over equality throughout?
I'm not sure whether I'm not sure whether I want to say that. I think that's something else. I just want to put on the board what, because I don't understand all the implications, and I'm a bit reluctant to, but it appears that way. I'll say that. And
sorry, I was just asking, I suppose, was that the point you were trying to get at? So it probably wasn't exactly that, but it looks as though the sin of the US is them prioritizing freedom over equality. That's what it's kind of looking like.
Yes. I think it's that. I think that's where it's heading. And I guess it goes all the way back to, even when we look at the mindset of states' rights. So you've got.
Didn't Tess say in her study that's what happened in Eden, that's what happened in Bennett?
That's right. And I was about to perhaps mention that. I've got a couple of minutes. So states' rights. See, you've got this federal government and you've got all these states. And the states are saying, one says equality, the other says, no, we're not here. We have the freedom to act, do, behave how we want to behave. We are autonomous outside of that. And so whether you bring that forward to the United Nations, it's the same model. Whether you bring it to, what was the other one in League of Nations, same argument. You've got a group here. Let's just all of a sudden say it's not the federal government, it's God's government. And what are these then? If this is God's government, what are these? Worlds. What does Earth do? What does Adam and Eve do?
They want the freedom.
We have states' rights. We have the freedom to, even though they had freedom because they could eat whatever they want, but they chose a particular version of government. They said, no, we don't want this overbearing big government telling us and taking our freedom. And this was the thing that Satan sold Adam and Eve. And they said, no, we don't want this overbearing government. We want to have the freedom to do what we want to do. So this model is, we're going to look at that in detail. We're going to go through this history, and we're going to draw these models as we go as well.
They did it knowing it was going to hurt people.
And that's the thing. They did it. I have the freedom to do what I want, even if it takes away the equality of every other living thing. So if this was the federal government and this is the states, I have the freedom to have slaves, even though it takes away the equality of certain people. So I guess the sin of America is it compromises and adopts this model. which takes us all the way back to Eden. But that's
All the way back to him.
all the way back to heaven. Yes, you're right. So we'll stop there, and if anyone's got a quick comment they would like to say before we close, or a question, I'm not sure whether I'll be able to answer. Okay. Well, let's close with prayer. Dear God in heaven, we thank you for your goodness towards us in providing us this life-saving information that helps us to navigate this time. We thank you for the methodology that you've given us. We thank you for our leaders that help us understand what you're trying to tell us. Help us to love what you love and hate what you hate, and help us to make that complete transition to a mindset that loves your kingdom and your government. We pray for blessing on everyone who is listening and those of their family members and loved ones, and bless us with the remainder of this day. We're just grateful. In Jesus' name, amen.